Hello, everyone, and welcome to the appropriately named for Halloween Take the Fear Out of 2024 Azure Planning. Today's webinar is sponsored by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Keith Ward. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. But before we get to today's content, there's a couple of housekeeping things I need to run past you that I hope you get the most out of this session. Leading off, we want you to ask lots of questions during the event, which you can do in the questions box in your webinar control panel right there where it says questions. Hey, I also asked this in an earlier event I did. If you're doing trick-or-treating tonight, let us know what you're going as. Tell us in that Q&A box. We would love to hear how you're going to be dressing up tonight for Halloween. Now, that Q&A box is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, and slide advancement issues, so that's the first thing you want to do if you have any problems. If that doesn't work, well, try another refresh. If that doesn't work, then let us know, and we'll try to help you out as best we can. Next, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, just to the left of that questions tab, you'll find some terrific resources, including 3 free handouts from Veeam that I encourage you to look at now and click on and download. So those resources from Veeam include an Azure Buyer's Guide, an Azure demo video, and an Azure Best Practices ebook. Now, other links in that handout section will take you to our Gorilla Guide book club, where you can get access to our huge library of technical books on a wide variety of topics. There's also a link to the Actual Tech Media Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. Next up, at the end of this webinar event, we'll be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Now, you do have to be in attendance during the entire event to be eligible for that prize. The official terms and conditions of the prize drawing can be found in the handouts section. So if you like a lot of really boring, lawyerly reading, that's the place where you want to go. And finally, today, one of the great things about this event and all of our events is the ability to ask questions of our expert presenters. So to encourage those questions, as we do today, we have a special additional prize for you, and that's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. Now, after the event is over, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's move on to our main event here. For your entertainment and enjoyment and illumination today, we have got 2 great presenters from Veeam, and they are Leah Troscianecki, a Principal Product Marketing Manager for Public Cloud, and Jason Buffington, VP Market Strategy. They are both movie buffs as well, as I found out, and so delighted to have them on today. Leah, I think you are going to be taking this first, so I am going to turn the mic over to you. The ball is in your court.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, we are big movie fans, hence the theme that we have today. We were just talking about some of our favorite horror movies and some of the recommendations that we had. We sort of bounced around, though, playing that sort of like 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon kind of thing, where we said, oh, I love Lost Boys, and oh, so-and-so was really good in that, and oh, you should watch Stand By Me, and it was a great little chat. So hopefully everybody has their Halloween movie picked out for tonight. I think I'm going to be checking out the latest from Mike Flanagan on Netflix tonight, House of Usher, which is inspired by the Edgar Allan Poe poem. So I'm super excited to check that out. Yes, I will be dressing up for Halloween. My dog and I will be Barbie for this year because everyone is Barbie. So that's the plan. Jason, I don't know what you're planning on dressing up as, but I know you have kids and grandkids and lots to entertain with. So I don't know if you want to share what you are doing for Halloween this year.
So I will be in charge of sugar distribution for our house. The grandbaby is too small and has not had shots yet. So we're keeping him from the wicked world out there. And then all the rest of my kids, I mean, I guess one of my kids is down in college, so I don't want to know what she's dressed up as or what she's doing, right? But hey, let's take the fear out of Azure planning.
Hey, let's do that. I mean, speaking of things that we need to be preparing for, I think everyone is afraid of 2024 planning. I know I always am. From budget management to thinking about changes in market conditions, there's just so much that is always around the corner. And this is always a great time of year to be thinking about what you need to be thinking about for the year ahead. So what we wanted to do was kind of weave in some things that are top of mind for the Veeam team, but then also weave in a lot of what we see as top of mind from Microsoft. Of course, Jason and I are actually both ex-Microsoft, so we've both been in the Microsoft ecosystem for a long time, so hopefully we can be some good tour guides for you guys. We've wanted to layer in a couple of really great frameworks that Microsoft has around cloud adoption and cloud resiliency, so that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. How do you harness the power of the cloud effectively without ballooning budgets, but also being aware of the constant changes that are happening in the industry around things like AI and cyber resilience? There's so many of these kind of big conversations that are happening. But at the end of the day, a lot of us just need to keep our heads down and get the job done. So a lot of the frameworks and advice and considerations that we're going to be talking about today are extremely practical. This is not a bunch of ivory tower, pie in the sky kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about. So to do that, we're just going to kind of structure this around 3 different conversations. So first and foremost, I mentioned that we're really big fans of something called the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. I think it's a great set of best practices and considerations, as a lot of organizations have a cloud-first approach. I've heard some people call it a cloud-right approach, though, and I think that's probably more of where the industry is going to. A lot of people are recognizing that this rapid adoption of the cloud may not be the best way forward, and thinking more intentionally about cloud adoption is probably going to be a better way for us to execute in 2024, especially as we look at things like cost reduction and cybersecurity. So we're going to talk a lot about that. We also here at Veeam, as I said, have a lot of things that are top of mind in the backup and recovery space. And that was part of why I asked Jason to join me today on this webinar, because he is actually our head of market strategy and market research. So we've pulled together a lot of really great third-party, non-Veeam specific research that we want you guys to be thinking about as a sort of macro level set of trends. I think it's always helpful to see what other people are thinking about, what other people are planning for. So hopefully you can kind of work that into some of your plans. And then we wanted to talk a little bit about what Veeam's got going on. We have Microsoft Ignite in just a few weeks. So I've brought in some sneak peeks of some of the things we will be talking about at Ignite. So we'll pull those kind of 3 things in together. But first, like I said, let's orient ourselves to Microsoft and the Microsoft Cloud. And I think the big reason we wanted to pull that into today's conversation is because so much of the conversation over the last few years, especially in the last couple of years in the wake of COVID, it's been about this rapid movement to the cloud. And all of our research has told us that obviously everything was trending to the cloud, but in that wake of COVID, but especially chip shortages, supply chain issues, we saw a lot of people rapidly move to the cloud. And what we're hearing anecdotally, but also in the research, is that so many folks lifted and shifted a ton of stuff to the cloud, and then they're finding that it's expensive or not optimized, not working well, not performing. So what we wanted to do is kind of come back to the basics and maybe give you some things to kind of think about that Microsoft recommends when you're looking at your overall cloud strategy. So I'm going to take the next couple of slides, but Jason's going to pop in here with a lot of the thoughts that he has, and he has a great opportunity to speak with lots of IT teams around the world. We have an amazing customer advisory board that we get to interact with. We go to a lot of trade shows. So Jason and I will hopefully pepper in a lot of kind of anecdotal data throughout this sort of framework discussion. So to start, what we wanted to do is talk about the kind of core benefits of migrating to the cloud. And sorry, give me just 1 second. I think I accidentally clicked a little bit too far here. So the first thing we wanted to talk about is the core benefits of cloud migration. But I don't think that slide is appearing for some reason, because why would technology work correctly? It's a Tuesday. We don't want things to be working well. I mean, I can pantomime what's on the slide. That'd be fun. I don't know that that's going to load. Well,
yeah, that is so weird. Actual media, if you can help us with slide 9, that would be fantastic. Hey, look.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so, so much. I know that was one that was giving us trouble earlier, so I appreciate it. So with slide 9 here, we wanted to take a look at what Microsoft themselves considers to be the core benefits of migrating to the cloud. Now, they really break this into 2 different buckets. The first is technical benefits. And I think a lot of these are going to be self-explanatory, but some of them do need to be instantiated. So I think it's understandable and expected that the cloud gives you scalability that you oftentimes wouldn't be able to build yourself on premises. It is architected in a high availability framework. They have redundant power and multiple internet service providers and all sorts of things that us as kind of independent data centers would never be able to achieve. And of course, capacity optimization is one of the beautiful things about being in the cloud. You can spin up on-demand resources and pay as you go. I think one of the interesting conversations that's happened over the last 8-9 years of cloud adoption has been, how secure is the cloud? Is it more secure? Is it more compliant? And I think we're here to say in general, the answer is yes. It's just that the bad actors are getting infinitely smarter in the process. So we're going to talk more about security and compliance and some of the benefits, but things to navigate in just a minute. I think what's been interesting is that there are lots of financial benefits, as you can see here from Microsoft's talk track. However, however asterisks, that means that there's a lot of onus on you as the user of the cloud to optimize your spend and avoid bill shock. And bill shock is a fun term that we love to talk about. We certainly hear it in a lot of these conversations. And it really boils down to the fact that the cloud is just a little too easy to transact. And it's a little too scalable at times. It's a little too easy to ramp up capacity. And all of a sudden, your next bill could be incredibly expensive. So we've actually pulled in some really great slideware from Microsoft themselves to talk a little bit about cloud FinOps. But first, Jason, I just wanted to get your thoughts on kind of, if we're taking Microsoft at face value here, I do think these are a good set of benefits to keep in mind. But do you have any sort of talk track around these?
Yeah, when we think about the technical benefits, it would be easy to get a little trite and say, the cloud is just somebody else's data center, right? It is, but it's a data center that's run by people that you can't afford to hire, run at a scale of efficiency and an assurance of a supply chain that you can't guarantee. Right. So, yeah, it's somebody else's metal compared to your metal. But with the run on that kind of scale, it does provide some radical improvements, no differently than, I've known some small businesses over time that they had a half rack in some closet in one building, and then they moved to the new building and it has raised floor and cable trunks and all that wonderful stuff. It's like, oh, wow, everything's just better. And I'm going to tell you, if you're running your servers and you're not running them in a hyperscale cloud, you're not enjoying everything just gets better. That said, when you think about scale, when every time you want to spin up a workload, you have to fill out a purchase order and wait for the gear to show up on the dock, and then you build it and manage it and prep it, versus I'm going to click 4 mouse clicks and all of a sudden I've got new server spinning and then I wonder why my bill is out of whack, right? So sometimes, admittedly, that level of agility, someone once said a weakness is somebody's strength gone too far. And if you've ever seen my personality profile, that's true. But in this case, the agileness, which is such an amazing strength, especially in Azure, the weakness of that is it is way too easy to provision a whole bunch of stuff that you forget about later. So anyway, that's my riff on everything that's amazing and wonderful and dangerous about Azure.
Yeah, it's both a superpower and a kryptonite. And I think that's where some of the elements of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework come in, because I think what they want to do is sort of get everyone in the posture of continuous improvement. So I'm going to take us over to kind of the first part of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. And Riley, if you can pop us back to slide 10, I think that'll get us back on track here. Thank you so much. So this is the first part of what Microsoft calls their cloud adoption framework. They also call it a CAF, which as an ex-Microsoft person, I still have PTSD from the 20 million different acronyms that I had to learn while I was there. I did sit on my first 6 months of calls with a glossary. It was a whole thing. So I will not be calling it a CAF. I'm not going to inflict that on anybody. I will just call it Cloud Adoption Framework and take those few extra beats to say it. But in this framework, I do think it's a really great way to analyze, okay, we've gotten things up in the cloud, but how do we be more intentional and avoid some of the pitfalls of just how easy it is to use the cloud, as Jason and I have been talking about. So a lot of it comes down to really setting a strategy, which sounds kind of self-explanatory, but Microsoft actually gives you some really good templates to set strategies that I highly recommend. And then it becomes about planning, especially in teaming. So who is going to do what, who's who in the zoo, what are your roles and responsibilities? We're going to talk about that more in a little bit, especially when it comes to backup, recovery, security. And we have some interesting stats to show you on that. One of the things I did want to recommend that everybody should kind of learn up on is Azure landing zones. And I know Federico actually asked a question specifically about migration and moving an entire platform, and does Veeam kind of help with some of those things? And the answer is yes. When it comes to the actual data itself, using Veeam or any backup tool can be a great use case for migrating the data itself. But something that's really amazing about Azure landing zones is it becomes the sort of blueprint, if you will, for that migration plan. So it's not just lifting and shifting data itself, but in fact, creating an intentional plan to make yourself ready to catch that data. So for those who haven't ever looked into Azure landing zones, I highly recommend it. It's a great way to think about any kind of workload migrating to the cloud. But what's interesting about the cloud adoption framework is you've done that. Let's say you've defined a strategy, you've planned, you're ready, you go ahead and adopt it, you actually migrate and move that data. I think we all know that that's the day zero piece. And then sometimes there isn't a day two. There isn't that ongoing operations and management. And what can happen is ballooning costs. What can also happen, though, is security issues. So what they really recommend is this concept of kind of continuous improvement, right? So how do you get a hold on the management day to day so that you can see the entirety of your operations? How do you automate as much as possible so you can set a sort of governance baseline? And then ultimately, how do you have a security posture so that all of your assets are protected in this sort of continuous mechanism? So what I was showing before was linear, and I was doing that on purpose because I actually think this is a better way of thinking of it. It's this continuous improvement, constantly taking a look at things like access control. And Microsoft is, of course, one of the big leaders in zero trust as a principle. Taking a look at DevOps and DevSecOps, of really looking at how do we innovate in the space and keep up with constant changes to the threat landscape. And again, we're going to talk more about that in a little bit because security is such a big top of mind piece for the Veeam team. But also a lot of this comes down to some of the basics of setting policies, creating standards, documenting. Jason, I know you're a really big fan of documenting, and I say that as an inside joke between him and I because I think we spent the last decade talking about documentation. But do you want to kind of harp in on this idea of setting policies and standards and making this a continuous practice within an Azure team?
Why, yes, please. Yes, I would.
Yes.
Yeah. So, first and foremost, when we talk about, and actually, if you have the option to go back just that one slide, I just want to pile on because I think it sets some context on 11. For a lot of organizations, when you think about any time that you're standing up a new production platform, one of the key things that often happens is, and I've done this on Twitter for better than a decade, whenever you modernize production, you have to modernize protection. Now, when I say that, I've typically talked about backup. But honestly, the way we look at everything on the lower line of that, we really ought to be saying, whenever you modernize production, don't forget about protection, governance, compliance, all of the things that happen if you are moving a production workload from old network servers onto new Windows servers, if you are moving from an old Linux Oracle database and now you're going to put it on SQL on-prem, anytime that you are moving data between the platforms, you'd know if you were moving from one data center to another, you'd say all the stuff like role-based access and governance and long-term compliance and making backups because stuff happens, right? You would still know to do all that. And I think one of the things that a lot of folks forget is that the cloud is just another part of your infrastructure. And so all of those same IT core pedigrees that we're used to need to be part of when you embrace day one and beyond. And to do that on day one means it needs to be part of your planning process before day zero. So with that as the context, let's talk about on slide 12, let's talk about that iteration for a second. It starts with, do you understand what data is going where, right? And then from that, you define the architecture that's going to support for that. And I love that because at that point, you can actually have an authentic conversation of, and we'll get into the differences between, say, Azure IaaS versus PaaS versus SaaS, right? So there's different ways that architecture can fulfill on that. But it is iterative, right? So I think I'm going to stand it up in this cloud in this way. I'm going to go through the effort of figuring out how to transpose that data and get it running again. Now, is it working like it's supposed to? Is it costing what it's supposed to? Am I getting the performance it's supposed to? What do I need to change? And then what you'll find out over time is some of your processes will have to change. Some of your policies will have to change. And oh, by the way, over at Veeam, we know that some of your tools for accomplishing some of these goals will also have to change in order to provide the right level of governance and management over the data that you've now trusted to this new platform.
You know, what's interesting about this idea, though, of needing new tools is there's a time and a place to have a new tool for a new thing. But when you're thinking about infrastructure all up, that's where you kind of have to weigh how many point tools, how many point products am I going to use versus when do I need something that can truly handle kind of any representation of my environment. So this is, again, from the Cloud Adoption Framework. And I love this slide because I think it illustrates the reality that so many infrastructure teams are faced with, which is a lot of people think that the cloud is primarily the place where new apps are built. So that in this kind of analogy is that new building part of the equation, right? It was built for cloud from the beginning. It is hopefully using things like platform as a service, and it was built using landing zones and all these other things. But the reality is our research tells us that 2/3 of all data living in the cloud today was migrated from a physical server or a VM running on premises. And what we find is those kinds of workloads are moved to the cloud, and they're not necessarily picture perfect representations of a cloud deployment. A lot of it is lift and shifted, right? A lot of it is kind of like bolted on standards or even bolted on tools that kind of work if you squint sometimes. And that's the reality that a lot of people were in, again, especially during the supply chain crisis. And I was actually on the devices team at Microsoft during the whole supply chain issue. And it was just wild to watch, you know, the kind of free fall that the whole server business was in at the time. And so many people were just forced with the reality of putting things in the cloud because they simply couldn't get a server or be able to architect it well, right? But what that means then is now that we're looking at 2024, a lot of this stuff is up in the cloud. It's not optimized for it. It's probably bulky and expensive. It may not be secure. It may not be, you know, governed under centralized tools. So what do you do about that? And I think that's where you have to look at a couple of key categories of outputs that an IT department delivers and figure out how do we consolidate the documentation and the policies? How do we automate some of the things that were just on that cloud adoption framework earlier? And we think backup should be one of them. Obviously, we have a vested interest in that. But Jason, you have over 30 years of backup experience. I think it's safe to say that we've seen infrastructure transformation over the years. And we see this time and time again, that folks might implement a point product and then they find 5-10 years down the road that they need to consolidate down into one backup product, right?
Yep. Yeah. So one of the things I love about this picture is I do think this is just a perfect view of what most organizations' cloud journey looks like, right? So let's assume that the building on the left, the existing building, it's been there for 10 years. The company took over a couple floors of it. They're doing great. It's time to expand, right? So let's use that as the optimistic scenario. Every couple of years, if you want to adapt how you're doing infrastructure, you can knock down some walls, you can put up some new cubicles, right? You can do a lot of stuff. You can't move the elevators, right? You can't move the stairs. You can't move large spaces from one place to another. And I think for a lot of organizations, when they first embraced cloud hosted infrastructure, especially with the accelerant, right? It wasn't the driver, it was the accelerant of COVID. Satya Nadella said that, for many organizations, what was a 3-year modernization strategy was accomplished in months because you couldn't get in the data center, right? If you couldn't get in on a raised floor, then every new workload had to stand up cloudy. But the problem is that for a lot of organizations, basically what they did was they did a one-way migration and they said, okay, you used to be a physical server or you used to be a VM, and now you're running in infrastructure as a service, Azure hosting, or another cloud that wants to be Azure, right? So, but the problem is it still looks like a VM. It still looks like a server with all the encumbrance of that. And probably when you did it, maybe under duress or under a time condition, you made sure that new VM certainly was not going to run any slower than what you had on-prem. And you'd be surprised how many of those VMs are over-provisioned in CPU. They're over-provisioned in the speed and SLA of storage. And you pay for that by the drip. As opposed to, we know that same organization is like, hey, you know what? We're going to reinvent how we do whatever our core business is. We're going to build a new building that takes advantage of things that we've learned over time. And so we don't have to just move cubicle to cubicle and closet to closet. And we can put the elevators wherever we want. And we can have a bullpen or no offices at all, or whatever the new work style is for those who returned up to the office. But you can redesign, and that's where things like PaaS and SaaS and getting out of the minutia and just looking for outcomes becomes an amazing part of the journey. I guess the punchline is, and if you're taking notes on this, I'm going to tell you that if your journey to cloud stopped with, I took my VMs and now they're running on cloudy metal instead of physical metal. If that's where your journey stopped, i.e. Azure hosting, you're not realizing all the benefits that cloud offers, right? That you're not the benefits of abstracting and obfuscating the OS and the security model and taking advantage of new network paradigms. And oh, by the way, we're going to talk later about managed services and having smarter people than you manage it so you don't have to and you can focus on business outcomes. If you stop at just lift and shift into IaaS, you're not realizing everything the cloud could do for you, and frankly, that the company probably deserves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why it might be an imperative to start thinking about those things in 2024 by talking about BCDR. Now, there's 20 different words for backup. Microsoft happens to call it, it's like backup. We used to call it availability for a long time, which was hilarious. But Microsoft really puts us in a category called BCDR, business continuity and disaster recovery. And I personally think that's really apt because so much of why Microsoft advocates for having a backup strategy for Azure is because they recognize that there are still real threats to business continuity. And there are times when you might need to recover from a disaster scenario, for example, in the event of some sort of cybersecurity attack. So we're now going to take some of the research that we've compiled. And again, Jason can talk through how we come to a lot of this research and what it really means for us here at Veeam. But first, let me just kind of level set of what BCDR for Azure means to Microsoft. So they really think of BCDR for Azure as falling into one of two buckets. Number one, they look at it as an opportunity to protect Azure workloads. If you understand something called the shared responsibility model, which is a Microsoft term, but it's also something that AWS employs and Google Cloud employs, they sort of denote what the cloud provider's responsibility is and what your responsibility is. And the easiest rule of thumb is if it has anything to do with data, it's your responsibility. You need to make sure that you have a recovery strategy. So when they think of protecting Azure itself, They offer a wide variety of third-party integrations. Veeam is one of them. And there's two different deploy mechanisms. The first is spinning it up as software in an Azure VM, which is what we'll talk about in a little bit. But you also have the opportunity for software as a service, which I'm excited to say for the first time, Veeam actually now has a software as a service option for Azure. So we're going to talk about that a bit later, because that's a big hot item. We just recently announced it, and that's what we're going to be showcasing at Microsoft Ignite. So that is really, really fun to talk about. But to just continue to set the context here, the other kind of use case that they talk about is protecting to Azure. And of course, Azure is a really great cloud storage construct, right? They've got hot, cool, and archive tier storage. You can leverage services like Azure Express Route to improve that kind of ingress process. But Veeam actually has a great suite of on-premises tools. The biggest one being Veeam Backup and Replication. And you can actually use VBR to tier out your backups or even backup directly to Azure Blob Storage. And of course, store it on hot, cool, or archive, depending on your use case. So it's just kind of nice to sort of set the scene here of what we mean by BCDR, because now what we're going to do is talk a little bit about some top of mind considerations that we've been talking about as a Veeam team. And first, what we wanted to do is talk a little bit about the team, because what's been really interesting for us over the last couple of years is we are used to talking to the same folks. We are used to talking to people who typically work in a data center and who some or all of their job is backup. So these are backup nerds like us who like to talk about backup all day. And that's really been our community. That's been our bread and butter. But as workloads have been moving to the cloud, or even moving to platform as a service, DevOps for new app creation, maybe it's Microsoft 365. We're finding that more and more people want to get in on the conversation. So Jason, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of this research that we're looking at, how we come about this research, where it comes from, and then kind of how we've been reacting to this idea of roles and responsibilities with cloud data protection.
Yeah. So one of the things that I do at Veeam, so when I left Microsoft, I went and joined an industry analyst firm. So IBM, Dell, Commvault, Veeam, Quasti, Rubrik, all of them were my clients for years. So that's what I did when I left Microsoft, and then I left that analyst firm to come to Veeam. And so one of the things that we do is we go out to those analyst firms in the research panel houses and get them to then ask blind surveys to IT decision makers that we profile. So in this particular data, we asked the research company, go find 1,600 cloud administrators. So those who run hosting like IaaS, those who run platform as a service, those who run SaaS as a service like Microsoft 365, as well as backup admins, right? To try to understand what were their points of view on, do they back up? How do they back up? Why do they back up or not? And so all the data is always unbiased. This is not Veeam customers. The respondents don't know it's Veeam. You get the idea. So two interesting questions that kind of come out of this. So one of the questions that's come out of this is when the respondents were asked, who's involved in defining the strategy, I actually think they got it right. I like the fact that you're not seeing just one team, such as the central IT team, which is in orange in that upper left-hand side, as one folks saying, we're going to define the policies for everything. Because if you do that, what historically IT teams have found out is when you don't involve the application owners, you're going to miss something on how data is being protected, which means you should not be surprised when you can't recover it. So I love the fact that they're at, let's call it the head of the table. They have the highest percentage there, but cloud administrators are actually part of the conversation for defining that strategy and the determinate tools in about half of all conversations. So are the backup folks, right? So the cloudy folks know what needs to be protected and how. The data protection folks understand the tool set, and they're going to be ultimately responsible for how it gets done. And then you start seeing folks like application owners. So for example, if you're going to be living in Azure, it's great to have everything inside of Windows VMs, but Azure SQL rocks, right? And so having hosted databases and Azure File, that's where I actually store some of my stuff. Do that natively, but that means you're going to need those workload-centric expertise in that conversation. What you look on the right-hand side is the folks on the left decided that they should do it in frequency and strategy. The folks on the right are the ones most responsible for actually doing the job of ensuring data is protected. And one thing I really like about this is this question has been asked in the survey every year, every 18 months or so. I was asking this same question when I was an analyst. And what we've seen is over time, the blue wedge, meaning the workload owner, has gotten smaller and smaller. And the backup admin role has gotten bigger and bigger. And that's normal in the IT economy. So 17 years ago, when Veeam first started, you would have seen the virtualization admin be responsible for all the backups. The normal backup folks did everything that was physical, but this new VMware thing, it's kind of touchy and kind of new, and you don't really understand it. So the virt admin, who was responsible for the workload being available, did backup, and Veeam sold to the workload admin. But over time, never in the history of ever has a workload admin said, you know, someday when I grow up, I want to be a backup guy or gal. And so what happens is as trust is developed and as you show over time the reliability of protection, the workload owner says, you know, I'm good. I'll be responsible when there has to be a restore, but I am perfectly fine to let the experts handle the backup of those roles. And that's what you'll see is that shift year over year. And so today you don't have virt admins running their own backups. The core backup team does that. And where we are in this math on blue versus green on the right, we're seeing the same thing. The only difference is both of these teams are becoming really aware of the fact that there are some smart humans that work in managed service providers, and they live and breathe whatever the service outcome is that you're looking for. So how about we let them handle the capacity planning, the monitoring, the job retry, troubleshoot errors, whatever that is, so they can focus on recovery, strategy, etc. So there's a lot to unpack in this data. If you want to see the rest of the data, you should hit the QR code in the upper right-hand corner.
Awesome. So I think that kind of gives a good lay of the land of who might be responsible, who might want to weigh in on requirements. Jason, I think one of the other myths we sort of wanted to bust in this conversation was about platform as a service, because I think a lot of folks understand, or at least our research is telling us, that if you move a workload to the cloud and it's a virtual machine, a server, whatever, that is production data that you need to protect. So people kind of understand that you need to have some sort of backup strategy for IaaS. But when it comes to PaaS, it seems like there's still this really big gap in what people are doing to protect and be able to recover that data. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, I believe that if you, for some workloads, look, if you have a custom 3-tier application, you're going to want to run that in Azure hosting as traditional IaaS, right? But if you're running Windows file servers in Azure hosting, I feel like you're missing part of it. And this is coming from somebody who, by the way, I used to be part of the feature set for Windows Server and File, and I love file servers. I do. But Azure File is a better way to go, right? Same thing. You could run Microsoft SQL inside of a Windows stack, inside of a hosted VM, or you could run Azure SQL, right? Or other databases that want to be SQL. And so one of the questions that was asked in the last version of this cloud research was, are you backing up these workloads? I do think it's interesting that, so the green, I know the font got a little butchered. We apologize for that on the slide. The green says at least they are backing it up. The blue says they know they need to, but they don't have a solution yet. Yay for that. Little more concerned that the yellow says in both cases, we don't have any data that needs to be protected. I'm not sure why you would run any server anywhere or any service that doesn't have substantive value, which means you ought to be backing up. The part that actually concerns me, though, is the really dangerous red, right? So 1 in 5 folks are not backing up their Azure file shares. 1 in 14 folks are saying they're not that they don't need to back up their Azure SQL. And as you mentioned, Microsoft is very clear, right? It's your data. It's your responsibility. Now, Microsoft's infrastructure will ensure a higher level of durability of the underlying platform, right? So it's not going to burp as often as yours. You're not going to patch. For those of us that used to have Patch Tuesdays, You're not going to have as many scars from that. You're not going to have as many OS-centric issues. You won't have data corruption at the same frequency. Some of the tactical reasons why aren't there. And yet, you still got to make copies of your stuff, right? You still have compliance requirements. You still have rollback requirements. You still are vulnerable against cyber. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So what this data basically shows is at least most organizations, and I think maybe, Leah, the right way to think about this is, at least for most administrators, if you're running something like a database, you understand it has intrinsic business value. And so I like the fact that green wedge is bigger than it's just a file share. But bottom line, if it's data that was worth creating, it's worth backing up. And Microsoft will tell you that's not their job.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why it's even more imperative this year, or it's a completely solvable problem this year to do that. But before we get to that, I think one of the things we wanted to take a look at is what other folks are thinking about when it comes to backup, because backup, BCDR, has been a category for decades. And so there's lots of instantiated solutions out there, oftentimes in a sort of patchwork where you have lots of different tools for different workloads. But Jason, I know you spend a lot of time talking with folks who are actively evaluating as an organization what they want to do with backup. Do you want to talk
Sure.
a little bit about kind of what things folks are thinking about changing as they're looking ahead to next year?
Yeah, so easily one of my favorite questions that's in the survey every year is, and I've been asking this for, again, prior to even when I went to Veeam, when I was in the industry analyst, the main question that every consumer wants to know is, what would cause a change? No differently than if you are walking around on a car, a dealer's lot, and some salesperson walks up to you and says, hey, are you looking for a car? Well, yeah, maybe. What's driving the change, right? What do you want different? And maybe your answer is, well, I've got a 2-seater and just found out my wife is having twins, right? Can't have a 2-seater anymore. There's certainly reasons why that you figure out that you've outgrown whatever your legacy mode of transportation is. And I think that's where a lot of folks are in backup. What you don't see on the slide, the very, very top one, but it's muted out, is reliability, right? Simply the pragmatics of, I need it to work. And I don't want to underestimate that, because need it to work is often found when you try to apply a legacy approach to backup to a modern workload. So as an example, 15 years ago when VMs were first coming out and everyone said, we'll just put an agent inside of every VM, it'll work just like we protect physical servers. And it didn't. You didn't have reliable backups, and that's why people started buying Veeam. And we thank you for that. I think we're in that same inflection point where organizations are saying, file share, I can back up a file share, and then you're going to wonder why your egress fees are so high. Or Azure SQL, I'm just going to do an ODBC query and just pull all that down. That's not the best way to do that, right? And so certainly when you use a legacy approach in a modern workload, you're going to have some challenges. But let's take a look at beyond reliability, which absolutely is job one. Most important driver, most common driver, top driver of change, often because of inadequacy due to legacy technologies. That said, and I know this is a little bit of an eye chart. Again, hit the QR code. You can see it in a much bigger font. But I think it's interesting that the next one in line says we're going to use different data protection tools for different workloads. And that usually happens when someone is using a bunch of point products. We had a question in chat earlier today, and the question was, well, how can I do this when I don't have budget? And one of my answers was, stop using point products, because the storage doesn't mix and you're going to pay for licensing with each and every vendor, and it's cost prohibitive, right? So some folks are going to use different tools for different purposes. And yet right beyond that, just a few choices down, oh no, I need one tool that'll protect everything. Another pair that's in the same list, some folks are saying I need to move from an on-prem backup solution to a cloud-based service. We like that. We call that Cirrus. Other folks, nearly the same percentage, say we're going to move from a cloud-based service to on-prem backup. Hey, I need to take better control again. Some folks are saying they want an appliance. Other folks say, no, I want to run on my own metal, right? And so I guess what I would suggest for folks to take away is it's got to fit, right? Customer choice has to matter. And so if you're going to look at the two top macro drivers, what's driving change in data protection strategy, one, it has to be more reliable than what I'm doing before. And if you're very cloudy and you're using a legacy or older mode for backup, you're probably struggling with reliability. And then secondly, it has to fit in how I want to consume backup. I actually do my backups, Leah, back to my server in Dallas. I actually do pull some of my data out of Azure, bring it back on-prem. I have other data that is on-prem. I send that up to Azure Storage. And of course, I back up 365 as well. So it's got to fit how you need to be able to manage the data, not just where the data is. Can I get an amen?
Amen to that. Of course, always check those ingress egress fees when you do make that choice to go in and out of the cloud. But yes, I think that the reality is people want to be able to do it the way they want to do it. And I have some really great questions that have been coming in the Q&A. Please keep those in. A lot of the questions that I'm seeing are kind of specific scenarios of like, can I do this? And what about this? The reality is, as we continue to have this sort of hybrid and especially multi-cloud set of patchwork services, people want to be able to do it the way they think it'll make sense for their organization. So I think you're seeing that with a lot of this sort of change drivers research is people want lots of different things. And as long as the vendors that you're working with can stay flexible and don't lock you into a certain mechanism or a certain deployment model or a certain set of prescribed best practices, I think it's going to be the right kind of solution for you. Now, one thing we wanted to talk about too is cyber resiliency, because while there's lots of great benefits or different flavors of ice cream and different ways that you can do something, the one thing that's sort of unifying everybody is the looming threat of cyber attacks and especially ransomware attacks. It's very top of mind for the Veeam team. And we've actually been spending the entire quarter talking about cyber resiliency. What's been really exciting is taking a look at kind of the perception of the resiliency of cloud workloads specifically, and the proliferation of cyber attacks within those cloud hosted workloads. And Jason, I know we just recently posted a dedicated research brief about this of cyber resiliency in hybrid cloud infrastructures. Do you want to talk about some of the interesting insights that we saw?
Yeah, so this actually comes out of two different, this particular data, both these points come from a research report where the panel companies surveyed 1,200 organizations, all of whom suffered at least one successful cyber breach in calendar 2022. So this is lessons learned, not Veeam customers, unbiased panel. So two of the things that we're asked now, if you're gonna talk about or look at what happened in cyber attacks, let's take some lessons learned from that. There's two myths I want to debunk. The one on the left is they responded back with what kinds of systems were eventually affected during the cyber attack. And I want to say this is basically statistically a three-way tie. There's a 1 point variance between first and third space. In any cyber event, you should expect laptops to be affected because that was probably some silly user who clicked on it in the first place. Your Windows Server, when you are the lion's share of how IT runs, there's a large landscape there, and unfortunately not everyone patches. And so there's some vulnerabilities there. But I think it's interesting. The third most common affected platform was cloud hosted. Now, this is not to say that it's more or less vulnerable, but think about it this way. If you've developed a hybrid cloud strategy that is so transparent and so agile for your users that your users can barely tell whether they're accessing a server in a Dallas, Texas data center or in a somewhere undisclosed, maybe Vegas, Azure host region, if the users can get there that easily, so can the bad actors. Right? So anything they can do to encrypt or affect based on user credentials and access to those on-prem workloads, they can do the same thing wherever else those users can reach, the bad actors can too. So the left looks at percentage of platforms that were affected. The one on the right actually shows the amount of data that was affected within a given platform. Now, in here, the percentages aren't that different from one to the other. On average, 45%, by the way, is the fun math of your production data gets affected according to the survey. It was only like 2 points different than the amount of data percentage-wise that affected remote office and branch office. It was only 1 point different than what was in the data center. And I think that's a second myth we should bust here on Halloween, because the people assume that Robo is less secure. Well, it is, except that you can't actually get into most Robo. You have to get in through the data center, right? And people assume that the cloud might be different because it's not in your building. Let's just bust both those myths and say, if the bad actor can get there, or if the user can get there, so can the bad actor. That's why we're talking. And that's what the rest of that research brief is about.
That's super exciting. And I really think that it's a great opportunity for everyone on the line to really think about the fact that cyber can hit you from anywhere. And as all of our data is moving to different places, the attack vectors are wildly expanding. And while we're not a first-party security vendor, Microsoft has lots of services. There's lots of third-party products. And again, thank you so much for the questions coming into the Q&A, because there's been some interesting debate about using proprietary tools like Azure Landing Zones, for example, versus a third-party tool like Terraform. So I'm totally with you on that. There's an absolutely valid reason to use these sorts of third-party tools like security tools, because it's coming in from anywhere and you need to be able to defend, but also to recover. So one thing we wanted to talk about before we sort of wrap today was about FinOps. I mentioned that when we're looking at the cloud adoption framework, so much of that is recognizing that workloads are getting lifted and shifted into the cloud, and they're not necessarily being refactored. So they're not moving into these fancy apartment buildings like we were talking about in the analogy earlier, and it's oftentimes running up costs. This is actually coming from Microsoft's own documentation, talking about what's really top of mind for folks as they're building these really instantiated cloud estates. And they're finding that so many people are really struggling and worrying about the cost of the cloud, and especially managing overspend. So Microsoft actually does have some really awesome frameworks to be able to think about how you can manage cloud spend. And what's really interesting about their frameworks is so much of the onus of controlling cloud spend is coming down to the actual folks using the services. I think FinOps in the past has been a very procurement focused effort, right? Of taking a look at what are our purchasing decisions and how do we plan. You have people who have those kinds of roles in their toolkit, right? They are planners or buyers. But now so much of the cloud specific FinOps conversation comes down to the technology itself. How do you right size your workloads? How do you tier down to lower cost storage? How do you optimize your licensing? How do you reserve capacity? And overall, how do you think about when to use the cloud and when not to use the cloud? There was a really great question in the Q&A about when you should use the cloud. Is it better to use it for redundancy? Is it better to use it for load balancing? And I think it's going to ultimately come down to it depends, which is why we really recommend at Veeam using things like cloud cost calculators. And that's actually something that's built into Veeam's tools, specifically building it into the Veeam data platform. And I know we're running low on time, so I'm going to zip through a couple of slides here really quick. But built into the Veeam data platform for each one of these clouds is a cloud-specific cost calculator. And of course, it has to be specific to those clouds because pricing changes, API calls change, et cetera. So unfortunately, you will have to go kind of cloud by cloud. And for folks who have a multi-cloud strategy, I'm sure that'll be a little bit annoying. But at least you can really get that visibility to plan, hey, if I set a backup policy to this kind of retention period, or I'm backing up this often, here's how that might change my consumption. But oh, by the way, if I'm okay tiering this out to a cheaper storage like archive storage, where I might not be able to recover as easily, but it would save me half my bill, that might be worth it. So being able to model things like that is going to be really key. And especially for our Azure solution, that concept of cloud efficiency is so big to what we do. We also really focus a lot of our efforts, and especially a lot of our development lately, on security innovations. For example, we integrate with Azure Immutable Storage for Azure Blob. We integrate with Azure Active Directory and implement least privilege access controls. There is logical air gapping built into the solution. So when you're looking at, for example, and I'm sorry to make everybody dizzy, I'm just going to click through really quick to a diagram. When you're thinking about implementing a backup solution in Azure, one of the best practices that we have built into the Veeam solution is this idea of separating your data from production. And that's something that everybody does on premises. You typically have a backup server that you're using. But in the cloud, when it's all shared resources, you have to introduce the separation for resiliency. So using a backup solution will actually give you the opportunity to, yes, take a snapshot of your production data, but then create a backup from that and make it portable. So you could move it into its own Azure subscription, or as Jason said earlier, you could move it out of Azure and maybe onto an on-premises object storage server, or even to tape. If it's a long-term retention, tape really might be the best solution still. And you have the opportunity to do all of that with Veeam. Now, if that all sounds really hard, Jason mentioned earlier that a lot of folks just want to offload that kind of expertise to experts like backup as a service vendors. And for a long time, Veeam, our answer for that has been backup as a service providers. But we actually recently introduced our own solution called Cirrus by Veeam. And this is a backup as a service offering for Microsoft 365 and for Microsoft Azure. And what's super exciting about this is now, if you're thinking to yourself, I can't sit here and calculate out, oh gosh, what if I did this backup policy? What if I moved it to this? And I'm not a backup expert. A lot of people aren't. So using a backup as a service offering like this one from Veeam is a really, really great way to get that quick ROI to bring your costs down, but it's still going to give you that BCDR readiness that you need in order to keep your business resilient. So it's a really exciting offering that we just introduced into market. And I think it's a really exciting time to be thinking about what you want to do with 2024 and ultimately with your BCDR specifically. So with that, we're going to be in the Q&A answering some of these questions. I know I kind of lightly called out a few folks' questions out loud here and there. But I know, Keith, we really wanted to get to some of the exciting prizes. So let me turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jason and Leah. That was just a fantastic presentation. I know you had to run through it a little bit faster than you intended, but I did want to point out that you will get back to everyone who asked a question today. Whether or not the questions get answered, there will be follow-up, so don't worry about that. If you had a question for Veeam, you will be hearing from Veeam, so no worries there. And I want to thank you both for your great presentation, for the illumination we got from it, and for being here with us today. It's just been a delight to have you both.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you to Jason. And I am going to now get to our next bit here. And I'll just leave this up here for a second. They're going to be at Microsoft Ignite 2023. You can see the URL there. So make sure you are there as well. Click on that link and find out what they're doing. Always exciting to see what Veeam is up to. And with that, folks, we are just about wrapped for today. We do have one more piece of business to take care of, the Amazon gift card prize drawing. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, you do have to be present for the entire event to be eligible to win. And the winner of the $250 card for this event is Victor Grado from California. Congratulations to you, Victor. We'll be in touch ASAP to get you your card. And with that, everyone, we're done here today. On behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Veeam so much for taking the time to be here, for making this event possible. I want to thank all of you attendees for being with us and for all of your fantastic questions. That concludes the event. Have a great rest of your day. I want to leave you with one final thought, and that's the movie you should watch tonight on Halloween. I've been thinking about this during the event here, and I've got the perfect movie picked out for all of you. What you want to watch? I love the classics and some of the classic horror movies, so you got to put on Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. I mean, come on, Kubrick and Jack Nicholson and Axes and Here's Johnny and all of that stuff. For me, that's the recommendation for Halloween tonight. Have fun with your trick-or-treating, and I'll look forward to seeing you in a future event. Bye now, everyone.